There are moments when the sky seems to whisper, and then there are moments like this one, when it feels as though the universe refuses to stay silent any longer. If you have been sensing an invisible weight pressing against your thoughts, if ordinary conversations have suddenly carried unexpected emotional intensity, or if you have found yourself questioning situations you normally accept without hesitation, I want you to know that there is a reason this is happening. Today, July 27th, the Sun in Leo reaches an exact opposition with Pluto in Aquarius. At first glance, that may sound like another routine astrological event, another point on the calendar that comes and goes without leaving much behind. I do not see it that way. I believe this alignment functions like a spotlight aimed directly at everything that has been hidden beneath the surface. It does not gently invite awareness. It demands it. It reveals patterns that have quietly shaped your choices, relationships, ambitions, and fears, even when you believed you were acting from complete freedom. Once that hidden machinery becomes visible, it becomes almost impossible to return to the comfortable illusion that existed before. That is why today feels different. This is not simply about the planets changing positions. It is about your perception changing forever. Long before this exact opposition arrived, I had been watching the energy gather momentum, almost as though reality itself was preparing for a dramatic turning point. The signs have been impossible to ignore. Many people have spent the past several days feeling unusually restless without understanding why. Emotions that normally remain under control have become more difficult to contain. Minor frustrations have carried the emotional weight of much larger problems. You may have noticed yourself reacting more strongly than usual, not because you suddenly became more sensitive, but because this transit is illuminating pressures that have existed all along. If there has been a persistent feeling resting quietly in your chest, a tension that refuses to disappear no matter how much you try to distract yourself, please do not dismiss it as imagination. Your inner world has been responding to something real long before your conscious mind found the words to explain it. The body often recognizes transformation before the intellect is willing to admit it. Perhaps you have also sensed that an important relationship is approaching a crossroads. Maybe it involves a romantic partner, a business connection, shared finances, or another deeply personal area of your life where trust and vulnerability intersect. There is an invisible current moving beneath those experiences, and although its influence may not yet be fully obvious, it is already shaping the choices that will soon become impossible to avoid. Later, I will explain the specific astrological pattern driving these developments, because understanding it completely changed the way I interpreted everything unfolding around this transit. Before we reach that point, however, it is essential to understand why today deserves far more attention than a single planetary aspect usually receives. This moment cannot be separated from the larger picture, because it represents one piece of an extraordinary sequence. What is unfolding now resembles an intricate structure that has been assembled one layer at a time, each planetary movement reinforcing the next until the entire framework stands complete. During the next several days, 3 distinct shifts in power emerge from this larger design. Each one exposes a different dimension of truth, and together they create an atmosphere where denial becomes increasingly difficult. By the time this astrological window comes to an end, many people will discover that they no longer occupy the same emotional, psychological, or spiritual place where they began. The transformation has not arrived suddenly. It has been approaching steadily throughout the entire month, quietly preparing this exact moment of revelation. Most people look at today's opposition as though it appeared overnight, but the truth is far more fascinating. July has unfolded like an elaborate chain of events, each transit placing another piece exactly where it needed to be before the larger picture could finally emerge. Imagine watching one domino after another carefully positioned in perfect alignment. Each placement may appear insignificant by itself, Yet everyone knows what happens once the first one begins to move. That process began around July 20th, when Jupiter formed its opposition to Pluto. That alignment served as the first unmistakable signal that deeper forces were beginning to awaken beneath the surface. 2 days later, on July 22nd, the Sun entered Leo, bringing the focus away from abstract collective themes and directly into the realm of personal identity, self-expression, confidence, and authentic purpose. Suddenly, what had seemed like distant, external circumstances became intensely personal. Then, on July 23rd, Mercury stationed direct. The confusion, crossed signals, misunderstandings, delayed clarity, and mental uncertainty that had accompanied the previous weeks finally began to dissolve. It was almost as though a thick fog lifted at exactly the moment you needed clear vision most. Circumstances that once appeared confusing started revealing their true shape, allowing hidden motivations and overlooked realities to become visible. Yesterday added another essential piece when Saturn stationed retrograde in Aries. That event is not separate from today's experience. It forms a direct bridge into everything you are likely to feel as this opposition unfolds. Its deeper meaning deserves careful exploration because it influences the emotional and psychological pressure many people are carrying right now. I will return to that connection shortly, but for now, recognize the larger pattern. None of these events stand alone. Together, they create a carefully unfolding progression that reaches its most intense expression today. This is why I believe the pressure you have been feeling has not been imaginary. It has been building toward a precise moment of release. At 2:54 in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time, the Sun, positioned at 4 degrees Leo, formed its exact opposition with Pluto at 4 degrees Aquarius. That precise alignment marks the point where accumulated tension reaches its highest level. Yet remarkably, the story does not end there. Almost immediately afterward, the Sun continues into a harmonious trine with Neptune and then forms a sextile with Uranus. By July 29th, the full moon arrives in Aquarius, conjunct Pluto, while the Sun simultaneously joins Jupiter. Think about the rhythm of these events. The energy gathers, the pressure intensifies, the confrontation reaches its peak. Then something finally gives way. A doorway opens where previously there was only resistance. Something concealed begins to emerge into full awareness, and what steps through that opening has the potential to reshape the direction of your life. I genuinely believe this sequence reveals far more than temporary emotional intensity. It reveals where genuine authority actually exists once appearances fall away. This leads directly into what I consider the first and perhaps most significant shift in power unfolding through this entire sequence. At its heart, this is not simply about external control. It asks a much deeper question. Who truly holds authority over your life, and is the power you have been responding to actually as solid as it appears? The symbolism within this opposition makes that question impossible to ignore. The Sun, traveling through Leo, represents your essential identity. It reflects the creative force that exists only within you, your individuality, your capacity to lead yourself, your courage to express what feels authentic instead of performing a role designed to satisfy everyone else. Across the zodiac, Pluto moving through Aquarius represents an entirely different force. It symbolizes systems, institutions, collective expectations, technological influence, algorithms, social conditioning, and every external structure encouraging conformity over authenticity. It is the quiet pressure that constantly suggests life would become easier if you simply blended into the crowd, accepted the established script, and stopped questioning expectations that were never truly yours to begin with. When these two archetypal forces stand directly opposite one another in exact alignment, avoidance becomes impossible. A profound confrontation emerges between your authentic self and the version of yourself the outside world has repeatedly encouraged you to become. That confrontation may unfold through career decisions, personal relationships, financial obligations, family expectations, or even private thoughts you have never spoken aloud. Whatever form it takes, the central question remains unchanged. Are you living from the deepest truth of who you are? Or have you slowly surrendered pieces of your identity in order to satisfy systems that were never designed to honor your individuality? That realization may feel uncomfortable at first, but it also marks the beginning of extraordinary freedom. And as the next layer of this astrological story unfolds, you will begin to understand why this confrontation is only the first revelation in a much larger transformation. If the past several days have felt like an invisible tug-of-war inside your own mind, you are not alone, because I have been noticing the same unmistakable pressure. Everywhere I look, it feels as though the world is quietly encouraging people to become smaller versions of themselves. Workplaces reward predictability. Digital spaces reward imitation. Social expectations reward staying inside familiar boundaries. Yet at the very same time, something much deeper seems to be awakening within many of us, refusing to remain silent any longer. It is as though an inner voice has grown tired of compromise and is insisting that your real identity deserves to exist without apology. If you have been wrestling with that conflict, wondering why it suddenly feels impossible to ignore, this astrological moment helps explain exactly why. What fascinates me most is that this exact opposition between the Sun and Pluto could have unfolded as nothing more than a collision between two overwhelming forces. Under different circumstances, that kind of planetary face-off might simply produce conflict, resistance, and destruction without offering a meaningful resolution. Yet that is not the story unfolding now. Something much more sophisticated is taking shape behind the scenes. Astrologers who have studied complex planetary geometry have been watching a larger configuration develop around this opposition. Some describe it as a cradle configuration. Others continue to use its historical name, Barbault's basket, honoring the work of the French astrologer André Barbault, whose decades of research into long-term planetary cycles brought attention to this remarkable pattern. What makes this formation so extraordinary is not merely its appearance, but the way it transforms the expression of the energy involved. Instead of allowing the opposition between the Sun and Pluto to become an uncontrolled struggle for dominance, the surrounding planetary relationships act almost like supportive walls, containing enormous pressure until it can be redirected toward meaningful change. Neptune, traveling through Aries, and Uranus moving through Gemini, each establish harmonious aspects with both the Sun and Pluto, creating a balanced geometric structure that surrounds the opposition rather than leaving it exposed. Imagine enormous pressure building inside a river without banks. It would simply spread in every direction, creating chaos wherever it reached. Now imagine that same force guided through carefully formed channels, capable of directing its power with precision. That is the difference this larger configuration creates. Rather than encouraging explosive confrontation, it offers direction. Rather than allowing emotional intensity to consume everything around it, it provides an opportunity for conscious transformation. The trine between the Sun and Neptune introduces an entirely different quality into the experience. It gently dissolves rigid ego attachments and opens space for compassion, imagination, intuition, and spiritual awareness to enter the conversation. Leadership under this influence is no longer measured by domination, control, or the ability to overpower others. Instead, genuine leadership becomes an act of service, guided by empathy and a willingness to contribute something meaningful beyond personal recognition. At nearly the same time, the sextile between the Sun and Uranus introduces another essential ingredient. This is the spark that interrupts familiar thinking. It represents those astonishing moments when a completely unexpected realization suddenly appears. revealing possibilities that previously remained invisible because your attention had been trapped inside outdated assumptions. Sometimes, genuine breakthroughs arrive, not because circumstances change first, but because perception changes before reality has time to catch up. That is exactly the quality Uranus contributes here. When I stepped back and looked at this entire configuration together, one realization became impossible for me to ignore. The traditional model of power built upon fear, secrecy, domination, and the accumulation of control appears to be reaching the limits of its effectiveness. The very methods that once seemed capable of maintaining influence are beginning to reveal their own weaknesses. It feels as though an outdated operating system is struggling to function inside an entirely different world. What gradually replaces it is something far more authentic. The emerging expression of power comes through creative honesty, individual purpose, and the courage to align your unique gifts with something larger than personal ambition alone. Your Leo Sun is not being asked to shine for the sake of ego. It is being invited to illuminate a higher purpose that benefits both yourself and the people whose lives intersect with yours. That realization completely shifted the way I began interpreting everything happening throughout this sequence of transits. Although these planetary movements certainly have collective implications, and I believe we will eventually witness their influence reflected through broader social and global developments, their deepest impact begins much closer to home. They begin inside you. This opposition has an extraordinary ability to expose places where your own authority has quietly slipped away without your full awareness. Perhaps you have repeatedly silenced your opinions because preserving peace felt easier than speaking honestly. Perhaps you have minimized your talents because your confidence made someone else uncomfortable. Perhaps you accepted expectations handed to you by family, society, relationships, or professional environments without ever asking whether those expectations reflected your authentic path. These realizations may arrive with surprising intensity today. They may even feel painful at first, because clarity often exposes compromises we did not realize we were making. Yet if that emotional wave rises, I encourage you not to mistake it for collapse. I believe what feels like everything falling apart is actually the first unmistakable sign that something healthier is finally beginning to emerge. As familiar structures begin to crack, new possibilities become visible through those openings. That is one of the greatest gifts contained within the cradle configuration. It does not abandon you inside uncertainty. It quietly creates another path that may have remained hidden until now. Often we assume every difficult situation offers only two painful choices, yet this pattern suggests an entirely different outcome, waiting just beyond our current perspective. I have a strong feeling that this previously unseen option will reveal itself much sooner than most people expect. That naturally brings us into what may become the most emotionally significant part of this entire astrological sequence. Because while the Sun and Pluto describe profound questions surrounding identity authority and collective power, another set of planetary movements is simultaneously concentrating its influence much closer to your heart. This is where relationships, partnerships, emotional intimacy, shared commitments, and even financial connections begin entering the spotlight. Earlier, I asked you to stay with me if you sense something shifting beneath the surface of an important relationship, and this is exactly why. During the days immediately surrounding the exact Sun-Pluto opposition, both Mars and Venus established difficult aspects with Pluto. More precisely, each planet forms a tense, 135-degree aspect known as a trioctile, also referred to as a sesquiquadrate. These aspects become even more significant because they are simultaneously building toward the exact square between Mars and Venus, arriving on July 29th. When these planetary relationships combine, they create a larger configuration that some astrologers refer to as Thor's hammer, while others know it as the fist of God. Even before examining the technical details, The symbolism carried by that name communicates the extraordinary intensity surrounding this pattern. Yet what truly captured my attention was not merely the dramatic title, but the unique way these trioctile aspects actually operate. Unlike a square or a direct opposition, which often manifests through unmistakable confrontation or visible external conflict, a trioctile behaves much more subtly. It does not always point toward one obvious event that immediately explains everything. Instead, it creates a persistent undercurrent of friction that quietly follows you from one moment to the next. It resembles an ember buried beneath the surface, rather than flames racing across an open field. You may struggle to identify its exact source, yet your emotional landscape continues responding to its presence. Conversations begin carrying unusual weight. Small disappointments linger longer than expected. Financial concerns seem slightly more emotionally charged. Tiny misunderstandings inside close relationships gradually accumulate until they feel much larger than any single moment should justify. Nothing appears dramatic enough to explain the discomfort, yet the discomfort refuses to disappear. That is precisely why this pattern deserves careful attention, because sometimes the most powerful transformations do not announce themselves through explosive events. Sometimes they begin as a quiet pressure that patiently waits until you are finally willing to recognize what has been asking for your attention all along. And that recognition prepares the ground for everything this unfolding story is about to reveal next. Sometimes the greatest warning does not arrive through an explosive argument or an obvious betrayal. Sometimes it arrives as a feeling you cannot quite explain. A conversation ends without raised voices. Everyone appears polite. Nothing dramatic seems to have happened. Yet, you walk away carrying a strange heaviness that refuses to leave. Hours later, you are still replaying the exchange, searching for the missing piece you cannot quite identify. Or perhaps resentment has been quietly growing inside you without any single event large enough to justify it. Logic tells you everything should be fine, yet your heart keeps insisting otherwise. There is an uncomfortable awareness that something important remains hidden beneath the surface, something neither person has been willing to name out loud, and with every passing day, that silence slowly weakens the very foundation of the relationship. If this emotional atmosphere has surrounded you recently, I truly believe you are responding to something much larger than coincidence. Many people have been moving through exactly this subtle but persistent emotional landscape throughout the week, and the astrology offers a remarkably clear explanation for why these invisible tensions have become so difficult to ignore. Mars in Gemini, forming a trioctile with Pluto, introduces the first layer of this pressure. This aspect does not simply create disagreement. It transforms communication into a battlefield where language itself becomes an instrument of influence. Conversations may become less about discovering truth and more about securing psychological advantage. Passive aggression quietly replaces honest dialogue. Clever arguments become tools for maintaining control rather than creating understanding. Words carry hidden intentions beneath their surface meaning, and every unfinished conversation begins demanding recognition. Things that have remained buried for weeks or even months develop an almost irresistible need to be spoken. That process is rarely comfortable because it forces people to confront realities they have spent considerable energy avoiding. The discomfort does not come only from what is finally expressed. It also comes from recognizing how much emotional weight has accumulated inside everything that remained unsaid. Alongside that influence, Venus in Virgo forms its own trioctile with Pluto, and the emotional focus shifts from communication into the delicate territory of trust, affection, and emotional security. This aspect reaches places inside relationships that often remain hidden beneath practical routines and everyday responsibilities. It exposes situations where love has gradually become connected to performance instead of genuine acceptance. It reveals relationships that have quietly slipped into patterns of exchange where affection feels earned rather than freely given. Sometimes that dynamic appears through another person's behavior, yet sometimes we discover it living inside ourselves, and there is no shame in acknowledging that possibility. You may recognize moments when your desire to help became excessive, when your attention to detail slowly transformed into constant criticism, or when your need to solve every problem quietly became an attempt to maintain emotional control. On the surface, these behaviors appear practical, responsible, even caring. Beneath them, however, Pluto invites us to examine a much deeper emotional truth. Often hidden underneath relentless helpfulness lives an ancient fear of being abandoned. Hidden beneath perfectionism may exist the belief that your worth depends entirely upon your usefulness. Somewhere inside, a quiet voice may have been whispering that if you stop fixing problems, stop proving your value, or stop making yourself indispensable, love itself might disappear. I want to approach this realization with compassion because I know how deeply personal it can feel. Yet I believe this transit gently but firmly asks each of us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Genuine intimacy cannot be manufactured through constant correction. Trust cannot grow beneath endless evaluation. Authentic closeness asks for something that Pluto's shadow resists almost more than anything else. It asks for surrender. It asks you to loosen your grip instead of tightening it. It asks you to risk vulnerability instead of relying upon control. Those words may sound simple, yet living them often becomes one of the most difficult emotional lessons a person can experience. That does not mean every relationship is destined to unravel during this period. I do not believe that at all. Instead, I believe the greatest pressure falls upon connections that have quietly survived through avoidance instead of honesty, through manipulation instead of openness, through unspoken resentment instead of authentic communication, or through power imbalances that neither person has been willing to acknowledge. Those are the relationships most likely to feel the weight of this configuration. The symbolism behind Thor's hammer becomes especially meaningful here because its purpose is not simply destruction. I believe it exposes what lacks genuine integrity while preserving what possesses authentic strength. Relationships rooted in truth may certainly experience uncomfortable conversations, yet those conversations become opportunities for deeper connection rather than permanent separation. Relationships sustained only by illusion, however, may discover that illusion can no longer support their weight. As Mars and Venus continue moving toward their exact square on July 29th, this emotional process reaches its highest point. The conflict may emerge between longing and necessity, between emotional instinct and practical judgment, between thoughts that remain carefully restrained and feelings desperately seeking expression. The internal tension may become intense because different parts of your own heart seem to pull in opposite directions. Yet I sincerely believe that beyond this period of friction lies something profoundly valuable. Clarity begins replacing confusion. The uncertainty that has surrounded important relationships gradually gives way to unmistakable understanding. You begin recognizing what truly deserves your energy and what no longer aligns with your emotional well-being. You start seeing which compromises strengthened love and which compromises slowly erased your own identity. If someone important in your life has recently felt emotionally distant, if conversations have become unusually heavy, or if an invisible wall seems to have appeared between you, pay close attention during these coming days. The emotions rising to the surface are not random interruptions. They are revealing truths that have patiently waited for the right moment to become visible. Facing those truths may require courage, yet I also believe they create the possibility for something far healthier than continued silence ever could. Every excuse that once delayed honest conversation gradually loses its power because reality itself begins asking to be acknowledged without disguise. That realization naturally leads into what I believe is the deepest transformation unfolding within this entire sequence of planetary events. Because beyond questions of collective authority, and beyond the complexities of intimate relationships, lies one final confrontation, the one taking place inside your own mind. This last shift is not primarily about external systems or other people. It is about the private stories you have repeated to yourself for far longer than you may realize. Yesterday, Saturn stationed retrograde in Aries, beginning a retrograde journey that continues until December. What immediately captured my attention was the timing. Saturn reached its station only 11 hours before the exact opposition between the Sun and Pluto. I cannot ignore the symbolism contained in that sequence because it feels like another essential piece fitting perfectly into a much larger design. Saturn and Aries already represent dramatically different energies. Saturn values structure, discipline, endurance, responsibility, and the patient acceptance of long-term consequences. Aries embodies initiative, urgency, instinct, courage, and the immediate desire to move forward without hesitation. Placing Saturn inside Aries already creates internal tension because the planet associated with restraint occupies the sign least interested in waiting. Once Saturn begins moving retrograde, however, that conflict no longer expresses itself primarily through external circumstances. Instead, it turns inward, directing every unresolved question back toward your own inner world. That inward movement reveals something I found surprisingly difficult to accept when I first recognized it. Many of us have become remarkably skilled at giving respectable names to our deepest fears. We describe hesitation as wisdom. We call avoidance careful planning. We convince ourselves that timing simply is not right, that additional preparation remains necessary, or that a few more unanswered questions must be resolved before we finally take meaningful action. Certainly, some situations genuinely require patience and thoughtful timing. Saturn itself teaches the value of deliberate progress. Yet I believe Saturn retrograde in Aries possesses an extraordinary ability to reveal the precise moment when healthy patience quietly transforms into emotional protection, when understandable caution gradually becomes an elaborate explanation designed to hide something much deeper. During this retrograde, the stories you have told yourself about why you cannot move forward may begin losing their persuasive power. Beneath every carefully constructed reason, another truth may patiently be waiting, one that has less to do with circumstances and much more to do with the fears you have not yet fully allowed yourself to face. And that is exactly where this journey is preparing to lead next. When you step back and look at everything unfolding together, a remarkable pattern begins to emerge. The Sun, opposite Pluto, reveals every place where you have unconsciously surrendered your authority to something outside yourself. Thor's hammer shines a light on the relationships and emotional bonds that have quietly drifted out of balance. Then Saturn retrograde arrives with an entirely different question, one that reaches deeper than either of the others. It asks why you have continued waiting for approval that was never truly yours to receive. Think about that for a moment. Approval from whom? A supervisor, a romantic partner, a parent whose expectations have echoed inside your mind for years, society, success, some invisible definition of who you should become that you absorbed so completely you eventually stopped questioning whether it ever belonged to you in the first place. I believe this is the point where many people finally recognize that illusion for what it is. What has been stirring inside you is not simply anxiety, and it is not merely imposter syndrome whispering in your ear. I believe this period is exposing something much more profound. It is confronting you with the realization that the permission you have been searching for has never existed outside your own heart. No external authority was ever destined to arrive and announce that the time was finally right. That responsibility has always belonged to you. At first, that realization can feel overwhelming because it removes every comfortable excuse. Yet hidden inside that same realization is extraordinary freedom. Once you understand that no one else is coming to authorize your life, you also discover that no one else has the power to prevent you from living it authentically. If that awareness has been quietly growing inside you throughout this week, then you are already moving in rhythm with this astrology. As Saturn continues its retrograde journey through Aries during the months ahead, lasting until December, I do not believe it is encouraging reckless action or impulsive decisions. Quite the opposite. This retrograde invites a complete redefinition of courage itself. Many people imagine courage as something dramatic, loud, immediate, or fearless. Yet I believe Saturn teaches a far quieter version of strength. Real courage appears each morning when you choose to honor your own values instead of abandoning them for convenience. It appears every time you maintain healthy boundaries, even when doing so feels uncomfortable. It appears whenever you accept responsibility for your direction without placing blame on circumstances or waiting for someone else to rescue you from choices only you can make. That form of courage rarely attracts applause. Yet it builds something infinitely more valuable. It builds a life that rests upon genuine integrity rather than temporary validation. Naturally, this lesson will express itself differently depending on where Aries touches your birth chart. If Aries carries significant emphasis in your chart, this retrograde may feel like the beginning of a complete reconstruction of your identity, encouraging you to rebuild confidence from the inside rather than relying upon outside recognition. If Leo holds a prominent position, your beliefs, personal philosophy, and understanding of purpose may be undergoing a profound transformation. Ideas that once offered certainty may no longer satisfy the deeper questions emerging within you. If Aquarius plays a major role, attention may shift toward communication, encouraging you to examine whether your words truly reflect your authentic thoughts, instead of merely expressing what others expect to hear. If Pisces is strongly emphasized, themes surrounding self-worth and financial value may become especially important, inviting you to stop postponing the recognition of what your abilities and contributions genuinely deserve. Although these experiences differ according to each chart, the central message remains unmistakably consistent. Stop handing your authority to external circumstances. Stop delaying the life you already know you are meant to build. Begin creating that foundation yourself. At the same time, this transit carries an important reminder. Attempting to force outcomes through ego, aggression, or reckless determination will almost certainly invite Saturn's corrective influence. Saturn has always been the teacher that rewards responsibility while exposing shortcuts. Yet if you approach this period with humility, honesty, accountability, and patient determination, Saturn offers something that cannot easily be taken away. It helps construct an inner foundation capable of supporting the person you are gradually becoming. That foundation will matter enormously because everything introduced throughout these transits reaches its decisive turning point on July 29th. On that day, the full moon rises in Aquarius while forming a conjunction with Pluto, and at the very same time, the Sun joins Jupiter in Leo. Visualize the symbolism contained within that sequence. Jupiter enlarges everything it touches. It increases visibility, expands potential, and magnifies existing energy. Therefore, when Jupiter stands beside the Sun in Leo, immediately after the exact opposition with Pluto, everything uncovered during the previous days becomes impossible to overlook. Your confidence may increase. Your sense of direction may become strikingly clearer. Your awareness of purpose may feel stronger than it has in quite some time. Yet Jupiter never discriminates between what we prefer to amplify and what we would rather ignore. It expands both strengths and weaknesses alike. If you have sincerely engaged with the truths exposed by the Sun-Pluto opposition, Jupiter can magnify confidence rooted in authenticity. If those revelations have been avoided, however, Jupiter may also enlarge denial, inflated certainty, overlooked blind spots, and the temptation to rush ahead before genuine inner transformation has occurred. Across the zodiac, The full moon in Aquarius stands opposite this concentrated Leo energy, marking the emotional release point within the entire sequence. Full moons have always symbolized culmination, bringing hidden processes into visible expression. Positioned beside Pluto, this particular full moon shines directly upon deeply rooted patterns, inherited conditioning, emotional attachments based upon fear, and unconscious habits that continue connecting you to versions of your life you have already outgrown. The insight emerging here feels both simple and life-changing. Familiarity should never be mistaken for genuine security. Remaining inside a group, community, relationship, or system only becomes meaningful when your authentic self is welcome there. If belonging requires abandoning your identity, silencing your truth, or shrinking your spirit, then what appears to be acceptance may actually be another form of captivity. That realization carries enormous consequences. If you have continued holding on to a relationship, a responsibility, a belief system, or even an outdated image of yourself, despite knowing in your heart that it no longer fits, I believe this full moon marks the point where the universe no longer encourages delay. It calls for release immediately. This is not a gentle adjustment unfolding over endless months. It resembles a collective shedding, a powerful clearing away of what can no longer accompany you into the next chapter. Those who cooperate with this process, allowing old identities and outdated structures to fall away naturally, may discover themselves entering a reality that feels more aligned, more truthful, more empowered, and more liberating than anything they previously imagined possible. Those who resist every invitation to change may instead experience increasing pressure as life continues revealing the limitations of familiar patterns. I do not see that pressure as punishment. I believe it functions as a persistent invitation toward growth, one that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore with time. As we reach the end of this extraordinary sequence, there is one final perspective I hope remains with you. I understand these transits carry enormous emotional weight, and some of what they reveal may initially feel uncomfortable. Even so, I sincerely believe this period represents one of the defining astrological passages of the entire year. The exact opposition between the Sun and Pluto, strengthened by the harmonious geometry involving Neptune, Uranus, and Jupiter, does not resemble random chaos unfolding across the heavens. Instead, it resembles carefully designed architecture, a cosmic blueprint guiding profound transformation. Every power shift we explored belongs to the same, larger process. The exposure of false authority, the restructuring of your closest relationships, and the reclaiming of your own inner courage are not isolated experiences. They support one another, each preparing the ground for the next. Most importantly, I do not believe these events are happening against you. I believe they are unfolding in service of your evolution. During today and throughout the next several days, remain attentive. Notice what unexpectedly becomes visible. Notice which situations naturally dissolve. Notice which emotions rise after external distractions finally become quiet. Somewhere beneath all that noise, another voice has been steadily growing stronger. It is calmer than fear, steadier than doubt, and far more honest than old conditioning. I believe that is the voice worth trusting now. What you have been sensing is real. Your experiences are not imaginary, your reactions are not excessive, and you are certainly not walking through this transformation alone. Before we finish, I simply want to thank you for staying with me all the way through this journey. Your time and attention genuinely mean more than you know. If this conversation spoke to something inside you, and you would like to continue exploring these kinds of astrological insights together, subscribing would truly help support the channel. I would also love to hear your experience in the comments below. Tell me what has been shifting in your own life, what emotions have been surfacing, or what realizations these transits have brought into your awareness. I read every comment because I believe We learn as much from one another's experiences as we do from the astrology itself. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself. Remain mindful of your energy throughout these coming days, and I look forward to sharing the next chapter of this journey with you very soon.